Welcome to Jacobin Show. It's me, producer Kale. Typically you would be seeing Jen right now, but Jen is off this week. She'll be back next week. But boy, oh boy, do we have a show for you, because it is debate night. We got 2 rounds for you. I think you're going to enjoy both of them. First up, we have Eric Levitz versus Branko Marcetic. They'll be discussing what the appropriate left response to the invasion of Ukraine should be. They've both written some articles where they've hashed out some of their differences. I hope this video actually furthers that discussion. Then we got Slavoj Zizek versus Vivek Chibber on the role of ideology and capitalism. Vivek has a new book out that we've covered on the show before. You should check out that interview. But I thought it would be a good idea to put him in conversation with one of the people who has done the most ideological critique against capitalism in the past few decades. So buckle in and enjoy the show. As the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine has now gone into its second month, the American left has produced a number of responses to the situation. Much has been made of both the Russian ruling class's aggression and the American ruling class's geopolitical interests in Eastern Europe, as well as what is the most appropriate means to achieve peace in the war and the region broadly. But this has provoked a number of criticisms and responses. Most of them have been pretty dismissive, but easily the most thoughtful has come from New York Magazine's Eric Levitz in a piece titled "The Left Has Half-Baked Answers on Ukraine." So to go into this, we are now joined by Eric Levitz, as well as Jacobin's own Branko Marcetic. Branko recently wrote a response article titled "What the Left's Critics Ignore About the Military Solutions to Ukraine." So I'm now going to hand it over to Eric, who's going to outline where the article came from, what the main arguments are, and then we'll hear from Branko, and it'll open into a little bit more of a larger discussion. So, Eric.
Sounds good. The impetus for the piece, there's been really sort of a diversity of thought about the Russia-Ukraine conflict within the broad American left. But within a significant portion of the socialist left, and I think the mainstream of DSA, the basic position has been to oppose sending military aid to Ukraine of any kind, and as well as opposing broad-based sanctions on Russia. I'm sympathetic to aspects of this position. I think I broadly, tentatively agree with the position on sanctions, and I tentatively support the arming of Ukraine, and so object there, although my views are a bit unsettled on that. What I was most concerned with in the responses to it was less the positions themselves than what I felt like was the quality of a lot of the argumentation, which I felt like failed to acknowledge or anticipate sort of counter-arguments and objections that I think are very prominent within the discourse and come, I think, pretty readily to mind if one really sort of scrutinizes the question. And I thought that was important, sort of an important failing, in part because the positions that the socialist left is arguing against here are really overwhelmingly popular among Americans. There's broad public support in polls for arming Ukraine and sanctioning Russia. And these positions also have significant traction among the broad liberal left and a lot of people who are potentially, very sympathetic to socialist politics. I know multiple DSA members or people who were DSA members who have left the organization out of alienation from these positions. And so given that climate, I think it's, just for the, to the extent that socialists are going to succeed in persuading the unconverted about this stance on the conflict, and to the extent that they're going to more broadly just sort of build their base, I think it's really important to reason about these questions, really carefully and seriously, and steel man and anticipate sort of what the skeptics' objections are going to be. So what I saw as kind of a key weakness in the arguments was sort of this presentation of seeking a diplomatic resolution to the conflict and providing military aid to Ukraine as sort of self-evidently antithetical positions, and not addressing the objection that, potentially a militarily strong Ukraine might be a precondition in order for a diplomatic resolution to be possible. So in the piece of Branko's that sort of kicked off our back and forth, he wrote that in opposition to sending arms to Ukraine, and argued that peace could only be achieved by a mutually acceptable negotiated settlement that guarantees Ukraine's territorial integrity while addressing Russia's longstanding security concerns. So my primary critique of that piece was that it framed military aid to Ukraine as an alternative to such a settlement without addressing the counter-argument that military aid might be necessary in order to achieve one. And I think that there's some evidence to support that position, even if it's not necessarily dispositive. So we know that at the invasion's outset, Russia declared its interest in conquering, fully demilitarizing Ukraine, dissolving its army, and regime change in Kiev. They had sort of very maximalist military goals that would have completely eroded Ukraine's sovereignty over its territory. And it was the Ukrainian army's unanticipated success, its strength in fending off this much larger Russian force and imposing far more casualties and losses of equipment than the Russian leadership had anticipated, that has led the Kremlin to at least signal right now that it might be amenable to a settling basically for the annexation of the Donbass, a land bridge from Crimea through to Russia, along with Ukrainian commitment to neutrality and several other provisions. It's not 100% clear, whether that would in fact satisfy the Kremlin, and there's a bunch of obstacles to sealing that as an agreement. Nonetheless, we are moving towards a situation where the kind of agreement that both Branko and I support seems a bit more possible, and it seems to be downstream of Ukrainian military strength. So there is this question of what role Western military aid actually played in Ukraine's battlefield performance thus far, and I am, I don't have the authority to speak definitively on that. It seems to me from the reporting that I've seen that, Javelin and Stinger missiles, various forms of air defense have proven important in Ukraine's military success. I do think that even if one discounts the importance of specific military aid and weapons provisions since the invasion, if you consider that the Ukrainian defense forces have been built up for several years through Western military aid in the form of training operations and various forms of assistance since the 2014 invasion, I think it's hard to sustain that Western military aid has played no role in Ukraine's capacity to fend off this invasion. I think that those on Branko's side of the debate would argue that military aid itself, is a cause of the war, that it was a provocation to Russia. And I think that's a serious argument. But I also think that, we kind of, none of us has access to the inner workings of Vladimir Putin's mind. And so I think we fundamentally cannot dismiss the possibility that, like other megalomaniacal leaders throughout history, including George W. Bush, Putin may have launched a regime change war in Ukraine out of offensive imperial ambitions rather than defensive security concerns. In which case it's possible that, had the West withheld military assistance since 2014, that Russia would control a great deal more of Ukraine, and perhaps even have managed to take over Kiev, which could have precipitated sort of the same protracted counterinsurgency war that we saw when our government took over Baghdad. And so, for these reasons, it just seems to me that it's not obvious that withholding military aid in Ukraine would either have been conducive to a settlement of the conflict that would have preserved Ukrainian territorial integrity, even over part of its territory. And nor is it clear to me that it would have advanced the goal of just peace, even if we stipulate that we're not that interested in Ukrainian nationalism. It seems to me that everything that we've seen so far indicates that that Russia is not capable of commanding the legitimacy necessary to occupy Ukraine and establish peace and stability, that this would lead to counterinsurgency war. So there are other arguments that I made, but I think that this is the central point of contention between Branko and I, so I think I might leave off there.
Yeah, I guess it's my turn. I want to say I have a great deal of respect for Eric, and I love reading his stuff. I disagree pretty heavily with the argument he was making. I mean, my piece that basically that was responding to this, the first thing we have to understand is that there's limits to what we can do. When I say we, you can say the United States, the West, whatever. There's really profound limits. Just as with the Iraq War, when Bush invaded Iraq, there were limits to what could be done. And no one suggested, let's pour money into Iraq's security forces, let's give them weapons, let's try and train them, let's give them intelligence support to try and fight. No one suggested that because there was a real danger of the war, which was terrible and appalling, but it was not necessarily worth it to escalate the situation beyond what it was and potentially turn it into a wider confrontation, turn it into something that could end up being a nuclear war. It's a similar case here. My hesitance to support military aid, and when I say military aid, I mean the lethal aid, the offensive aid, the tens of thousands of rifles, grenade launchers, grenades, missiles that are being just sent into the country, and are basically, from the sounds of it, being kind of distributed pretty indiscriminately, is that for the unclear benefit, and I'll explain why I think it's unclear, the unclear benefit of actually what that will bring, I think it does not weigh up to the potential risks, which are really serious and which, unfortunately, in US discourse around this war have not really been talked about at all. They've sort of been swept under the rug because they're very inconvenient to the kind of rah-rah jingoistic message that has been pushed for the US and other Western countries to intervene more forcefully in Ukraine. And just to be clear, I'm not saying Eric is doing a jingoistic argument, but that's kind of the climate right now. Number one, I'm sure the military aid has had some effect. I think it's also worth noting that apparently even US intelligence believed that Kiev was going to fall in 2 days, and it didn't. And there's big questions about why that didn't happen. Military aid is one answer. Of course, that's one that's going to be preferred by people who are in favor of that policy, or even further US military expansion or intervention in this conflict. But also there's the fact that, and this is not me saying it, this is a piece by William Arkin, veteran journalist in Newsweek, who talked to analysts working for the Pentagon and retired Air Force officers. They point out that, for instance, the Russian Air Force has not really been used throughout the war. It has a little bit, but not to the extent that you would imagine. Why is that? There's several different possible strategic reasons why they decide to do it, but it is just as likely that Putin miscalculated in some way, and that the Ukraine's surprising resistance is less to do with some of these things that the US has been doing, as helpful as they might have been, and more to do with a whole bunch of other factors, including some of those things that the US alleges, that Russian troops are low on morale, that they're confused and don't really know why they're there, they don't really want to be there, that they're working with faulty equipment, so on and so forth. Okay. But, like I said, I don't know. And we don't know, no one knows. I think it's going to be a long time before we actually know what exactly happened. But what are the risks? It's not as simple as just you send all these weapons into the country. Ukraine is able to be stronger against Russia. They fight them down to some sort of stalemate, and then a peace is reached, and that's it. Because those weapons don't disappear the moment a peace deal is reached or some sort of ceasefire agreement is reached. Those weapons are still around. And there's the worrying issue of the fact that, of course, it can go on the black market and go God knows where, through Europe, potentially into Eastern Europe, who knows, maybe even into the Middle East. What that would cause, at this point, we can't say, but that's a very worrying thing. But there are also really Ukraine-specific concerns about what it means to just flood the country with weapons. And the Ukrainian far right is the most worrying thing. At the moment, there's this, because Putin used this pretext of denazification to justify the invasion, because that's such a big part of Russian propaganda. In the West now, there is this wholesale kind of attempt to either just never talk about this issue, or actually to I've now started seeing reporting that's kind of playing down, the importance or the power, the influence, or even the radicalism of the Ukrainian far right. But Ukraine has had a serious far right problem for a very long time. There's not just the Azov regiment, which is part of the National Guard, but there's all sorts of right-wing militias, militias that are white supremacists. They're anti-democratic. They view their path to power as going through violent means. And you have to remember that they did manage in part to do this once. The 2014 revolution, the Maidan revolution, it was overwhelmingly pro-Western liberal Ukrainians who were driving that protest movement. And they were concerned about issues like corruption and authoritarianism. But that protest was also in many ways hijacked. And if you go back and look at Western reporting from even US government funded outlets before, 2021, 2020, they all say this openly, which is that the far right did have a really important role in those protests. And the kind of crucial moment where that Yanukovych, the president, decided to flee was basically when they had come up with a political settlement with the opposition. The opposition went back to the Maidan protesters, and the protesters were not happy about this. And an ultranationalist, one of the ultranationalist leaders, he came up on stage and he said, basically, if Yanukovych is not out of here by tomorrow morning, we are going to storm the presidential palace, we're going to storm parliament, and we're going to take him out. And he got the hell out of there. So they succeeded at doing this once. In the successive years after that, the Ukrainian far right people always point to the modest electoral success of the far right to say, so there isn't a problem in Ukraine. That's not really how it's measured or how you should measure the influence of the far right in Ukraine. They are a very militant and well-organized activist movement. They regularly resort to street violence to get their way. And they've been pretty successful at shifting the political center in Ukraine into a more ultra-nationalist direction, with the government passing things that kind of glorify Nazi collaborators and discriminating against Russian speakers in Ukraine. For instance, when Petro Poroshenko in 2015 tried to implement part of the Minsk Accords, which were agreed to as a solution to the fighting in the east, in the Donbass, what happened was there was a massive protest outside Parliament. The far right staged confrontation. There were grenades being thrown in. I believe 3 police officers or 3 security members were killed in that scuffle. And basically, from there until this very war, the far right has consistently said, basically, whether it's Poroshenko or Zelensky, who, by the way, ran and won an insane mandate on a peace platform, they have said if anyone tries to implement some sort of peace, which they regard as a capitulation to Russia, we will, they'll pay for it with their life. We will attack them. And that wasn't the last time Poroshenko was attacked. Zelensky himself has been threatened by these far-right figures. I think a few days before the war was launched, even the New York Times said, Zelensky's in a bit of a difficult position here because the far right that are the most effective fighting force against the Russians. They're also a double-edged sword because what they could end up doing as well is overthrowing his government if they decide that the peace he settles on isn't acceptable. So this is what the New York Times was saying, just a few days before the conflict. Now, my question is, what happens when there are weapons just spreading through the country, thousands upon thousands of weapons. Some of those are going to disappear to the black market. They're going to make their way into basically any Ukrainians willing to fight into their hands. What does that mean for these far-right militias? What does it mean for the future democratic prospects of Ukraine if suddenly there is a better armed and actually battle-hardened ultra-nationalist bloc that's willing to use violence, that's willing to overthrow the government by force if need be, and that views any sort of peace with Russia as a capitulation? What does that mean for what could happen in the coming months, years? What does it mean for the vulnerable groups who are targets of violence and harassment by these far-right militias? The LGBTQ community, the Roma community. We don't know. We don't know what that's going to lead to. And the thing I always think about is it's that infamous Zbigniew Brzezinski quote from is it the late 80s or the no, it would have been sometime in the 90s when he justified the US equipping and funding and training the Mujahideen in the 80s in Afghanistan against the Soviets. And the quote was, and I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but it was, what's more important, the liberation of Europe and the end of the Cold War, or a few stirred up Muslims somewhere in the Middle East? And of course, those words became very, very tragically ironic in less than a decade later, when, of course, those stirred up Muslims ended up carrying out the worst attack on US soil in the form of September 11. And we have to remember that the far right in Ukraine was, long before this war, kind of an epicenter for far right organizing all over the world, including from the US. There were American extremists who were inspired by Azov, who went over to Ukraine to make contacts, to get training, that kind of thing. I think we're not nearly close to the end of what this war is, and we don't know how it's going to go. But I think we have to remember the failure of all of us to be able to see, years and decades into the future, and what it might mean, to side, even if it's indirectly, to tacitly side and support violent extremists now out of temporary convenience, that can become a very untemporary inconvenience later on. And I'll just say, in terms of what whether the military aid has helped to kind of strengthen Ukraine's hand. I mean, Russia's military aims certainly have changed. They seem to be stepping back from the regime change goal. I don't know if that's going to stick. We'll see. I hope it does. But I think it's also worth noting that in terms of the actual negotiating demands, Ukraine has successfully given more. Ukraine at first was unwilling to budge on the NATO issue. Zelensky, a week or two ago, said, you know what, NATO's not going to happen, and we're happy to talk about neutralization. Zelensky also was pretty firm on not acknowledging any of Russia's territorial demands. The other day, he said that he was willing to compromise in the Donbass, and he sort of walked it back. But it does seem like, military aims have changed, but the negotiating demands, Ukraine seems to be giving more and more, at least as it stands now, as this war goes on. So I think that's also worth going into. But yeah, I think the risk to both American life and the risk to Ukrainians, the stability of Ukraine, the stability of the entire region, I think could be really upended by just sort of continuing to pour military aid in there. And I think we have to grapple with this fact if we are going to make a case for sending these weapons into the country.
So I'll say up front that I think that in Branko's response to me, I think the strongest point which he sort of referenced at the end there, I failed to acknowledge the existence, of Ukraine's far right in my piece, and I do think that was a genuine oversight, and I take his argument very seriously, and I guess my general I'm still navigating trying to navigate this situation with humility as someone who is by no means a expert on this region or this nation. But I guess I have sort of some questions about, Branko's argument. So I think that there's just a little bit of a disconnect in the analogy with Afghanistan, right, where the direct object of our aid and the agent that we were empowering in a conflict were directly the extremists themselves, the Mujahideen, whereas here we are arming a sovereign, legitimate government that has within its defense forces a prominent but fundamentally very small minority that are comprised of far-right militias. So I think this is an important distinction because it complicates, I think, the implications that this arming policy potentially has. At least, it seems to me, at least, it's not obvious to me that arming the Ukrainian government and its formal military would strengthen the nation's far right. In my understanding, the Azov battalion and other far-right militias that comprise a tiny fraction of the Ukraine. In my understanding, that they comprise a tiny fraction of Ukraine's defense forces. And it's also my understanding that, part of why Azov played such an outsized role in Ukraine's defense following Putin's 2014 invasion, and why they were incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard, was in part because the nation's formal military was weak. And there was the reason why the Ukrainian government felt compelled and does feel compelled to rely on and cooperate with fighters who, in Branko's own account, pose a threat to its own leadership, pose a threat to, Zelensky, is because of the limits of the state's formal military capacity. So it therefore seems at least possible to me that strengthening the formal military would reduce the leverage that far-right militias can exercise over Kiev, while also increasing the central government's capacity to crack down on the far-right militias in a post-war situation. And sort of separately from that, I believe that some of the heaviest fighting thus far and heaviest Ukrainian casualties have been concentrated in Mariupol, where the Azov battalion or regiment is concentrated. And so it at least seems possible to me that the percentage of Ukraine's, or rather that, Ukraine's neo-Nazi defenders are dying at a much higher rate than its non-far-right militia military, and thus becoming a smaller sort of fraction of its forces. And so I think that there's at least potentially that Putin's partial denazification of Ukraine might actually mitigate the problem that Branko raises. I guess the other issue here is that it's just not clear to me what the counterfactual is. I mean, I think that it's a problem for every argument, maybe, for all sides in this argument and in this conflict. It's such a difficult situation that it's hard to see what the alternative that is really plausible and that is acceptable is. But if we choke off all military aid to Ukraine, so as to deny weapons to its far-right members, what happens? Ukraine, has fascistic militias within its National Guard, but I think Russia's government, currently, especially this wartime regime, bears no small number of similarities to fascist regimes historically. LGBT Ukrainians will not live well if their lives are shadowed by the Azov battalion, but they wouldn't live well under Putinism either. And then, separately, it seems to me that in a scenario where Kiev fell, where Ukraine's sovereign government, fell, and far-right militias became sort of the locus of resistance to a reviled sort of Russian puppet regime, that the far-right might actually thrive under that scenario as well. It also seems to me that before all this started, before weapons entered the country, that I would imagine that these far-right militants were among the most well-armed Ukrainians in the country. So it's not obvious to me that the net effect of this military aid is to strengthen the relative power of the Ukrainian far-right, their power relative to the rest of Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian government. It seems plausible to me. Don't get me wrong, but I guess I'm not. It's not clear to me that is what the implication would be. I will say separately that I do have my own concerns about the implications of arming Ukraine that include the one that Branko has emphasized with the far right, as well as this question of, it seems like territorial concessions are going to be a precondition for any, agreement that Putin is going to accept. It seems to me that not really plausible that Ukraine can drive Russian forces out of the Donbass. And there's really staunch resistance to that within Ukrainian society. And so the question of whether or not in maintaining Ukraine's capacities militarily, does that sort of solidify intransigence that makes this deal impossible? That is something that concerns me, because I think, all else equal, very much think that, for all its faults, the, fledgling form of capitalist democracy, however corrupt and, with authoritarian tendencies and nationalist ones, Ukraine is, it is a less unfree form of government than Putinism. So I would like to see Ukraine maintain as much sovereignty as it can. At the same time, I think peace, war is hell, and I think that expediting the return of peace should be the number one objective here. And it's just not clear to me what actual policy course is conducive to that. And to that point, there was just one other thing that I wanted to raise, because it's a question that that I'm curious what Branko thinks on, and I'm not fully settled on it myself. But it seems to me, when I'm reading about the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, it seems to me that there has been progress. Ukraine has offered to forswear NATO membership, has expressed comfort with committing to neutrality between Russia and the West, so not involving itself in their conflicts, not hosting foreign military bases, etc., among other things. But what, in every report that I've seen, an absolute precondition for those concessions from the Ukrainian government has been the receipt of security guarantees from third-party powers, generally from Western powers. And, it's often viewed as like a consortium of like Turkey, China, Germany, France, and the US or something, all saying that they will, basically making a commitment that if in the event of future aggression against Ukraine, we will come to its defense. And this is a real sticking point for Ukraine, I think, understandably, because, their experience in 2014 is when Russia comes and conquers part of your territory, there's a very good chance that they're going to build up their forces over a period of years and come and conquer more of your territory. And if you do concede the Donbass and move the border between Russia, and, the Ukrainian capital closer, you move that border westward. If you make peace after Russia has decimated the Ukrainian military-industrial base, you're kind of setting yourself up potentially to be reinvaded within a few years. And that is, it's already a difficult challenge that Zelensky has, selling concessions to the Ukrainian people in terms of territory especially. And so it's been really emphasized that the way that he believes he can sell that is with pairing this, okay, we give this up, but that's the end of it. We have these security guarantees that ensure that Russia is not going to reinvade. So that seems like critical to a deal, yet it also effectively means the U.S. committing to confrontation with a nuclear superpower in the event that it invades Ukraine in the future. And so I'm wondering, whether Branko supports the extension of such security guarantees, and if not, how do we imagine, peace, an agreement being reached here? Because I have trouble seeing it.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me deal with the some of the points brought up about the far right. For one, I mentioned the Maidan Revolution, where the far right were using kind of hunting rifles and other kind of relatively low-level weapons. I mentioned the incident outside of the Ukrainian parliament where grenades were thrown, or a grenade was thrown. Now, imagine if those confrontations, instead of, those weapons, you had, militias armed with actual, assault rifles and grenade launchers and missiles. I mean, I think this is what we have to, and copious grenades. As far as whether Azov is eliminated, I have no idea, because, there's a lot of stuff that is just said out there about this war and it doesn't end up being true. That may well be true, but the Azov regiment was part of a wider movement. The Azov regiment was the only far-right militia integrated into the Ukrainian National Guard, but it's not the only far-right militia out there, and nor is it the sort of the be-all and end-all of the wider Azov movement. There are others out there. In terms of if the state could end up better putting down or cracking down on these groups, there's really serious reasons to doubt that. For one, I mean, the fact that the Azov regiment were brought into the actual official security forces of Ukraine gives you a hint about how the members of the Ukrainian government, not all of them, but are not necessarily unsympathetic to some of these far-right groups, or at the very least, they see them as being able to control them. The Interior Minister, Arsen Avakov, he was the one who brought them in because he was kind of allied with them, and he believed that they were kind of the key to his political rise. There has been reports for a long time in Ukraine that when far-right groups attack LGBTQ protests, the Roma people, others, when they disrupt city council meetings, or they attack left-wing organizing meetings, so on and so forth, the police don't end up doing anything. And one thing to note is that pre-war, there were ultra-nationalists who were part of the Ukrainian police hierarchy in key posts. But police didn't always actually end up arresting or doing anything to the far-right militias. They sometimes would actually arrest the people being attacked. It's not, I don't think it's quite as simple as thinking, well, now that there's more guns in Ukraine, and a lot of those guns, Ukraine is one of the biggest arms trafficking black holes in Europe. So those guns that have just been sent in there, a lot of them are going to disappear and end up somewhere else in the hands of other people. Also, the fact that Zelensky himself said, I'm giving guns to every man, woman, and child who wants to fight, doesn't exactly suggest that they have been kind of, they're doing background checks on every single person before they hand out some of these things. So I think all that's worth remembering. I think it's also worth remembering that the US, in sending these weapons and basically urging other countries or goading other countries to do the same, it's not doing it with the aim of allowing Ukraine to win. The explicit aim, and one of my big disagreements with Eric's piece is he treats this as a kind of hypothetical, as a kind of a trick for, I guess, myself or people on the left to kind of avoid dealing with some of the messy realities of the war. But in fact, it's not a hypothetical. This is a real strategy that is actually existing among US officials. They want to turn Ukraine into what Afghanistan was for the Soviets in the 80s, what Vietnam was for the United States in the 60s and 70s. They couldn't care less. I'm very sorry to tell everyone, but the people in the Biden administration could not care less about Ukrainians. What they want is they want to draw Russia into a protracted conflict that, even if Russia has a superior military force, if they are constantly having people being killed by a guerrilla insurgency that lasts years and years and years, that hopefully will end up destabilizing the country or weaken it so that they can then confront China without having a united Russian and Chinese front. And I think also potentially, maybe not the explicit goal, although I would urge people to read the piece that Niall Ferguson wrote for Bloomberg, where he quotes a senior administration official, quote unquote, explicitly saying that they hope that, ultimately what's going to happen is Putin gets thrown out. But that is also another ancillary, aim of this whole thing. We have to remember that the people running foreign policy, particularly in the United States, but in a lot of Western countries where foreign policy, the national security state, is taken out of democratic hands, and it's basically just decided on by a small elite in rooms, they have very different interests than the kind of humanitarian ones that, quite justifiably animate all of us here. And I think most ordinary people, they have something else going. And I think at this point, if you read the reporting since December, if you read, there was that David Sanger piece in the New York Times last week. I think it's not really tenable to say that this is just a hypothetical, that the US isn't explicitly trying to make this happen. Now, what can be done instead? My preference is not to have, Russia lording over a puppet regime in Kiev. I don't think that's anyone's preference. But again, because of the real dangers of just sending arms into this, the potential for destabilization in the near future in Ukraine, we have to do something else. And the thing that I have put forward, the thing that others keep calling for, including Zelensky himself, is the US, and not just the US, but the US needs to enter these negotiations. Unless we basically just go for the complete destruction of Ukraine, this war, like every war, is going to end with people in a room across a table from each other talking. And that is happening now between Russia and Ukraine, but it is not happening with US officials. And that's a mistake, both because US officials, whatever you think about the sanctions, they've imposed the sanctions. They are the ones who control the lever there. They're also, even though they're not directly fighting, even though Washington is not directly fighting this war, they are militarily intervening in the country. And so they should be party to these negotiations, as should NATO. Because if you are going to create some sort of stable security arrangement, I don't know what exactly that would look like, but if you're going to create one, you have to have those countries there, negotiating and talking about what that actually looks like. I think also China should enter. China's not involved in this war as the US and NATO are, but China is sticking by its kind of alliance, friendship, whatever you want to call it, with Russia. It is kind of the larger, in the same way that the US is the larger power behind NATO, China is kind of the larger power behind Russia. It makes sense for them to come in and to be able to sort of broker some sort of deal. In terms of the specifics of that, I cannot tell you what at least off the cuff here, what a stable security arrangement is going to look like. That's going to be something that has to be decided by all those people in a room, figuring out something that works for everyone. But I think that's what needs to be done. There is no real, unfortunately, no real pressure on the Biden administration to come into these negotiations at all. The media is either, why aren't you implementing a no-fly zone? Were you too quick to rule out World War III? Were you too quick to rule out nuclear holocaust? Or it's the kind of more soft military intervention. Let's send weapons in. I think there needs to be far more of a stress on diplomacy. I'm not the only one. Veteran diplomats and other foreign policy experts are out there. They've been saying this for a while. The only way this is going to end is through a settlement. The US should enter these negotiations. I think in terms of, again, what a security arrangement looks like post-fact, whether I'd be comfortable with the United States coming into fight on behalf of Ukraine if Russia invaded again, I think that would be quite dangerous and potentially very disastrous. I don't know if that's the security arrangement that has to be done. There's for instance, Vladimir Yushchenko, he's a Ukrainian analyst, and he's not the only one. They've suggested, what about, speeding up Ukraine's entry into the EU, give Zelensky some sort of win that he can point to his own population. And of course, that would have to be paired with a lot of economic aid, and not IMF loans, not payday loans, basically to bleed Ukraine, the Ukrainian population, but rather actual economic aid that rebuilds it in the same way that Germany was rebuilt after the Second World War. So that's sort of those are my responses, I guess, to what Eric was saying.
Yeah, I just want to say that I agree with. If I had the power, the United States would delegate the authority to, or rather the West more broadly, would delegate the authority to lift sanctions to the Zelensky government in negotiations. I do think that there's more that the U.S. could be doing to abet a peace agreement, and I would agree that the responsibility of American Americans in general and the American left in particular is to pressure our government to do what is conducive to peace. I do think that, to be effective in that role requires, really trying to navigate and engage with where mainstream opinion is, and recognize, sort of these complexities that I have been pointing to. I think that I will say that I just regarded the idea of the U.S. turning Ukraine into Afghanistan as a hypothetical, in the sense that Kiev's fall and what the U.S. should do in the event that that we're arming an insurgency is the opposition to Russia and Ukraine rather than the sovereign government, remains a hypothetical scenario. I do think that U.S. policy was preparing for that because, as Branko suggested, the Pentagon did not think that Ukraine was going to hold out as well as it did. I agree that the U.S., its imperative is not the well-being of the Ukrainian people, and its lack of concern in that regard, has contributed, to a degree that it's impossible for us to determine because of what we don't know, but seems to me to have contributed to the disaster that we currently have. At the same time, I think that it was just not within the last decade, the U.S. was looking to have a reset with Russia so as to counterbalance against China. It's not generally as a part of America's broad grand strategy. Opposition to Russia is not, the central goal there, and that opposition has fundamentally, in my view, become more prominent due to Russia's own decision to begin, to respond to, the Maidan with an invasion of Ukraine, and that is sort of what has soured U.S.-Russia relations to the point where, we're now at this juncture. And so it is not clear to me to what extent the U.S.'s affirmative policy goal at this point is to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, to bleed out Russia's resources, and to what extent that was sort of the game plan when the presumption was that the Ukrainian government was going to fall. And now it's sort of in this more ambiguous territory because the U.S. is confronting a situation that it did not anticipate. But Branko's points that the U.S. security state's motives are not purely humanitarian is certainly well taken.
So I'm to offer a question that maybe pivots and wraps up the conversation. It seems like there's two things going on. On the one hand, a lot of what you guys have been talking about so far is dealing with getting an accurate analysis of the situation, of the interests involved, so that we can get a better sense of the possible outcomes. But then there's also, this question of what the left's response should be to what's going on. That seems like the debate really started with what the left's response should be so far. And that's how I've understood why you both have been discussing what's actually been going on. That should be informed, our actual response should be informed by what's going on. But as we all know, the American left is virtually powerless. We do some ideological prodding and poking here and there, but the world really isn't made up of good ideas, it's made up of power. So the left doesn't really influence what's going on in any major way. Maybe a different way to put that is that the elites of the world, the various ruling classes, the American ruling class, the Western ruling classes, the Russian ruling class, the Chinese ruling class, they're all going to find solutions to this situation and others that fit more or less within their interests. So is the point of this debate that we're having is it, on the one hand, what is a better left strategy to influence the outcome of the war? Or is it, on the other hand, is it how do we have a greater understanding of these social dynamics of war, of sovereignty, etc., how to resolve these conflicts so that if the left is in a position of power, we can have better political solutions that lead to more democratic and egalitarian outcomes?
I'll go first. I think both. I think on the one hand, I think one day God willing, the left will have more power in this country and everywhere around the world. And these are thorny questions that we'll have to confront. And when we make the decisions that we make, they'll actually matter. Instead of just sort of being a theoretical thing. And I think it is worth thinking about this issue. I understand the drive to, we want to help them militarily. There's a sovereign country that's being invaded by a larger neighbor. The stuff we're seeing is horrendous, of course. That you would not be a human being if you didn't have that response. But this has always been the trouble with liberal interventionism, which is it's driven by emotion and not always driven by thinking about the practicalities on the ground. And that we saw so many times this has led to disaster. The Libya misadventure is one of the clearest cases, but you could go through so many others. So I think, as I said in the piece, I don't believe in pacifism in every single instance, no matter what. However, I am very keenly aware of, both because of the realities of Ukraine, which most people are very uninformed about. They just have a very surface level good guy versus bad guy idea of what's going on over there. Because people are, not because of the realities of Ukraine, but also because of the very well documented history of how military solutions, like sending military aid, like sending weapons and so forth into a country, can lead to long-term consequences. I oppose it here, and I think this is the kind of analysis that the left should bring, when, God willing, they have power sometime in the future. Beyond that, I, as a journalist, obviously I write for people who are, lean politically in a certain direction, but I hope that to some extent, what I put out there has a bit more of an influence to some of the discourse. As I said, right now, the entire pressure on the Biden administration is just to do more militarily. There's absolutely no the stuff I'm saying and the stuff some of the other left commentators that Eric pointed to are saying gets almost next to no purchase at all in mainstream discourse. And I think that's kind of dangerous because if the only pressure is for the US to get more and more military involved, to draw red lines, then it's going to bend to that pressure. I would hope that there are other commentators, there are other people, if they are interested in helping Ukraine, they rather than going to protests where they're calling for a no-fly zone, they go to protests outside the White House, demanding that Biden enter negotiations, that he do something about this ceasefire deal. Remember that in his State of the Union speech, there was no mention of ceasefire. And I believe he actually, whether it was in that speech or sometime else, he said, this is going to take a long, long time. That is very worrying to me. And I think the best thing for Ukrainians, if we actually care about them, is not to have this be a protracted war. It should be to try and find a solution as quickly as possible. And part of that solution, I think, rests in having the US into negotiations. So, if anyone's listening to this, pressure your congressperson. Democracy is very limited in the United States. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that popular pressure can't do anything. I think that's a better use of our energies, whether you're, a socialist, progressive, liberal, whatever. That's a better use of our energies than just sort of calling for more military solutions. And also, we should transition away from fossil fuels. That's my last little. If there's nothing else that this should teach us, we're getting a very visceral look at how if you sit on a giant reserve of oil and gas, you at the very least have a perception of yourself as being able to act in a variety of kind of outrageous ways because you have this very powerful piece of leverage over the international community, quote unquote. So let's really use this moment to aggressively invest away from fossil fuels and change our energy system, and hopefully not all die in a climate apocalypse.
I would second a lot of what Branko said there at the end. I also think that it is more useful to, I don't think that arming Ukraine needs any more, that objective needs more support than it already has. Whereas I think that pressure on the Biden administration to not seek not encourage, not seek a maximalist sort of agenda here, but try to facilitate peace. We need more voices calling for that, absolutely, as well as voices calling to forgive Ukraine's foreign debt and increase refugee admissions. I think that's the left's role is in the current context. I think is primarily to agitate for those things. I think that it's just important, given the opinion climate that we have, to really take seriously majoritarian sentiment on other aspects of the conflict in order for arguments along those lines to be heard and received with open minds. As far as does any of this stuff that we do matter, or are we just people who like to think about the world and argue, and so we do that, and we found a way to get paid a little bit for it, and I think we all probably have that existential moment of the soul, but I do think that it is a fact that Joe Biden, no one's idea, at least a few years ago, of a dove withdrew U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And in fact, the last two U.S. presidents, really the last three, were elected on kind of anti-interventionist platforms. I don't think that, one can credit the left in the broadest sense for that exclusively, let alone the left in the narrow sense of the socialist left. Nonetheless, I think that there was a real role played there. And, the fact is that the people who staff the Biden administration, increasingly the rising generation of them, are, overlapping. Their media ecosystem and media diet overlaps with that of the left's, and they do confront these arguments. And I do think there is a broad, in addition to the funding of institutions, like the Quincy Institute or whatever, there are more non-interventionist voices that have an ear in the Democratic Party, and perhaps maybe I'm skeptical, but perhaps the post-Trump Republican Party. So I don't think it's all totally pointless. I think that the discourse, there is a little bit of sort of elite suasion that can be done within certain very limited bounds. And then besides that, I think just sharpening the left's sort of internal sort of intellectual strength and health is a goal in itself. Especially since I think that it really is a very difficult and unintuitive landscape that we confront right now. There is no international socialist or workers' movement with any significant power. There isn't a, the chief rivals to American imperial power are both, fundamentally they're state capitalist. They are, if anything, more hostile to organized labor than the United States. So that it's just not obvious what the position in many of these emerging conflicts that are going to define, the next few decades. It's not going to be intuitive to people who broadly sympathize with the left where their values are supposed to bring them in those conflicts. And I think it's just important to have a really sort of open and vigorous debate about that stuff, so that we have both clear thinking and sharp arguments, even when we internally disagree.
Okay, well, I think we can probably end it there. Thank you both to Eric Levitz and to Branko Marcetic, probably two of our finest and most insightful journalists working today.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Thank you both for your time. And on that note, we're going to pivot again and hear a word from our sponsor, Verso Books. Join the Verso Book Club and get every new ebook that Verso publishes every month, as well as 1 to 3 books in the mail. All Verso Book Club members also get 50% off everything on the website. The Comrade tier is only $20 a month for your first 3 months, and if you join in March, you'll get these books. Feminism or Death: How the Women's Movement Can Save the Planet by Françoise Jacobin, a new edition of a classic work of French feminist theory. Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump by Assad Haider, a challenge to the way we understand the politics of race and the history of anti-racist struggle. The Politics of Immunity, Security and the Policing of Bodies by Mark Neocleus, an intellectual history that exposes the politics underpinning the way immunity is imagined. And The Benjamin Files by Frederick Jameson, the paperback edition of this comprehensive exploration of all of Benjamin's major works. Become a member today at versobooks.com.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Jeremy Cohen, and I'll be moderating this very special episode of the Jacobin Show today. We are privileged, honored to have with us two of the left's most important thinkers to speak on the important question of ideology and culture and what role these things play in the structure of capitalism, in working class organizing, and in left-wing politics today. So first of all, I'm honored to introduce Slavoj Zizek. He's a philosopher. Probably people know him, but I'll say he's a philosopher and critic whose work has covered everything from continental philosophy to psychoanalysis to Marxism. He's published over 50 books, from his first, The Sublime Object of Ideology, which meant a lot to me in college when it helped cure me of postmodernism, I used to say. And two, I think, three recent volumes on the pandemic. And he's also been the subject of a number of films. Zizek also holds many titles at many universities, including the University of Ljubljana, the University of London, Kyunghee University, and New York University. Second of all, we're joined by Vivek Chibber, actually really the guest of honor today in celebration for his new book, The Class Matrix, Social Theory After the Cultural Turn, which we'll be discussing. Vivek is the editor of Catalyst Journal and professor of sociology at New York University. He's the author of a number of books, including Locked in Place and Post-Colonial Theory and the Specter of Capital. And again, today we'll be talking about his new work, which asks us to profoundly reconsider the role of ideology in social relations in capitalist society and kind of move past both take in certain arguments from the cultural turn, but also move past them. So briefly, an introduction about the Class Matrix for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet. You should get it. You should read it. A major focus of Vivek's book is explaining what produces stability within capitalist societies. This comes out of the puzzle of why a system that is so racked by conflict has remained in place for several centuries and now rules the globe. If this is, as left-wingers think it is, a world that's organized along unjust and exploitative lines, why is it that rebellions aren't breaking out sort of everywhere all of the time? A classical sort of answer the left has provided, especially, we might say, in the Western Marxist tradition, to this question, to the sort of failure of revolutions, even in profoundly capitalist societies that seem in so many other ways to fit Marx's picture of where society was going. A classic kind of answer to this question is that culture and ideology, maybe even direct ideological indoctrination, to the values of the system have helped keep the system in place. Vivek's argument contests that claim and thereby goes against the current of a lot of social theory. So he's going to lay out that argument regarding the role ideology does and does not play in the process of capitalist stability for about 10 minutes, and then Slavoj will get a chance to respond before we open up a larger discussion, and I'll throw a few questions in the mix as we go.
Let me start with the puzzle that Jeremy raised, which is the central puzzle that the book tries to deal with, which is how is a system like capitalism, which is at its root based on domination and exploitation, how is it still around after so many centuries? The classic Marxist tradition addressed this question over and over and over again. Now, at the heart of the Marxist theoretical framework, of course, is an approach called materialism. And materialism has several different dimensions to it, but at the core of it is the idea that people, when they pursue their politics or their economic goals, they are basically guided by what's called their interests. So at the heart of materialism, social materialism, is a doctrine that social action is governed by people's material interests. So in the gamut of Marxist history, the assumption was that when you pose a question like how does capitalism remain stable, how do class actors interact with each other and engage the world, there was an assumption that the answer would be a materialist answer. It has something to do with their interests. In the decades after the Second World War, materialism became overshadowed by an approach which promoted and emphasized the role of culture and the role of ideology. Because in the post-war left, starting with the early New Left, people like Stuart Hall and E.P. Thompson and Raymond Williams and people around the New Left Review, there was this conviction that Marxists had not taken ideology seriously enough. And so many of the puzzles for Marxist theory would be answered by looking at ideology. Now, why did they think that? It was because they were motivated by this very question that we're trying to answer today. Why does the system remain stable? The question arose because in the teens and 20s and 30s, it seemed like Marx's prediction that capitalism produces its own gravediggers and they'll overthrow the system. It seemed like that prediction was coming true. But by 1950, it was clear that in the West, you'd entered a period of political and social stability. So how did a system that was supposed to have been overthrown by the exploited class in fact end up remaining stable over time? That was the question that the Western European New Left posed for itself. And the worry that they had was this, that we know that the structure of the system generates conflict, that the structure of the system is built around exploitation. The problem is that that structure is not generating the kind of social action that it was supposed to, which is a social action of the workers organizing themselves and fighting around their interests. So they accepted the description of the class structure. What they were worried about was that the predictions about the political consequences of the class structure were mistaken. So the puzzle became, could there be an intervening factor between the class structure and political consciousness, political action that disrupts and interrupts the predicted causal flow, the predicted consequences of the structure on action? And the immediate answer was, well, it has to be ideology. It must be culture. Starting with the Frankfurt School all the way into the Gramscians of the 1970s, what held all of them together was this notion that Marxists have overlooked the way in which cultural hegemony, cultural influence, the media industry affects workers' consciousness. And that was elevated to an even larger question, which is Marxists have overlooked the role of what's called the superstructure. So if you look at the intellectual history of much of the New Left, its single most important focus is culture. Its single most important focus is what's called the superstructure, things like that. And it's considered a theoretical advance to focus on that because this is the gaping black hole inside Marxist theory. Okay, so now what I argue in my book is that this is profoundly flawed. And it's profoundly flawed for the following reason. The New Left was stuck with this very awkward view that they accepted Marxist description of how workers confront capital and what the experience of labor is in capitalism. They accepted it, which was workers are dominated by their employers, they're exploited by them, they lose their autonomy, their wages are suppressed, they're treated to horrible working conditions, there's a loss of control over their lives outside of the workplace. They accept all this. But then they ask, why doesn't this turn into a political consciousness? And they say it's because workers are essentially socialized by ideology into accepting their place. Now, the difficulty with this view is you have to answer, how is it that the people who are undergoing these experiences somehow are simply by the force of ideology, the force of socialization, taught or persuaded to overlook their exploitation, to overlook their domination, and accept their place in the system? Underneath it has to be a view that the workers are dupes, or that they're irrational, or that they suffer from cognitive failure. And in my view, this is a deep problem inside the entire framework of the New Left. They accept the description of the class structure But then they refuse to consider the fact that workers might have good reasons not to organize, good reasons not to rebel, good reasons not to come together, and therefore either assume directly or imply that the workers are in some way cognitively deficient. So what I try to do in this book is to say, assume for a second that workers are reasonable, that they have a pretty good understanding of their surroundings. Could we answer the question of why they don't rebel if we work on these assumptions? And what I provide is an answer that the reason capitalism is stabilized in the post-war era is not because workers are fooled by ideology, but because the class structure, in addition to generating a conflict between workers and capitalists, has one more property, which is that it channels that conflict into manageable directions for capital. Marx was right, as was Lenin, as was Luxemburg, in saying that the class structure is built on exploitation and generates conflict between workers and capital. Where they did not sufficiently theorize was that the conflict does not have to take the form of collective action. They wrongly assumed that the conflict will take the form of workers coming together. In fact, what the class structure does is because it makes collective action, organizing, making unions so difficult, imposing all these risks and all these costs onto workers, workers find it prudent and rational to resist on an individualistic basis rather than take up all the risks of organizing themselves. Organizing, therefore, is not the natural consequence of exploitation and domination. It is an exceptional consequence, and it comes about in very particular circumstances through very particular work. The baseline reality of capitalism is that workers resist through individualistic means, not through collective means. But once you say that they resist individually, they will lose. They resist, but they lose because, of course, their employer is the much stronger party. So the secret to capitalism is, while it generates conflict, it also underwrites its own stability by channeling that conflict into manageable ends. Ideology, therefore, was wrongly inflated by the New Left as the source of stability. The source of stability is the class structure itself. And this is why you have this amazing fact that wherever capitalism has gone, into so many cultures, into so many regions, into so many ideological complexes, collective action has been the exception, not the norm. That means then that it has a way of stabilizing itself wherever it goes. Well, what is the common factor wherever it goes? The class structure. It is a material property of the class structure to generate stability by raising the costs of collective action. This means that the fundamental flaw of the New Left was this. They correctly understood that the class structure generates antagonism, but they wrongly attributed to ideology the role of stability. The class structure does both. The problem with Marx and Lenin was that they didn't sufficiently develop the implications of their own materialism. They knew what I'm saying to be true. You see it implicit in their writings, but they didn't raise it to the level of theory. When the New Left encountered this dilemma and tried to raise it to the level of theory, they wrongly reached for ideology. All right, now if it's the case that ideology is not the source of stability, but the source of stability is the economic and material constraints that workers face, is there any role of ideology at all? I say yes, there are two roles. In the stabilizing dynamic of capitalism, ideology plays the role of rationalizing workers' and capitalists' actions. So the New Left thought ideology becomes the motivating factor. It motivates workers not to rebel. It motivates workers not to organize. In my view, what the motivating factor in stability is the economic and social circumstances and constraints that workers feel. What motivates them is a prudent, rational response to their circumstances. What ideology does is that it helps them live with the choices they've made. They make the choices based on economic and material considerations, but those choices that are then rationalized and understood and interpreted by them through ideology. So ideology is, in a way, the cement, the glue that fills in the holes where the material constraints of workers are doing the deeper work, the more fundamental work when it comes to stability. The second role it plays, and this is, I flip the new left and the culturalists on their head. Whereas they thought ideology is important in stabilizing the system, in my view, ideology is important in generating the destabilizing factors, which is when workers try to organize themselves and try to create collective organizations, ideology is what enables them to undertake the sacrifices, to undertake the risks, to undertake all the heavy lifting they have to do, because it generates what we might call a kind of collective identity. That collective identity, what we call solidarity or solidarism, cannot be brought about simply through risk minimizing or benefit maximizing calculations. It's going to require real ideological work. So the role of ideology is not so much that it stabilizes the system. The stabilization comes from the material circumstances of workers. The role of ideology is that it's part of the arsenal of the working class, of socialist parties, to generate the social political identities that help workers overcome a lot of the obstacles to collective action and help them willingly take up the sacrifices that are inevitable in any collective struggle. Ideology, therefore, has two roles. It is the means through which workers and capitalists rationalize their entrapment within the structure. Capitalists rationalize it as well. They have their own ideological functions, their own ideological justifications for why they brutalize people, why they do what they do. The second role that ideology plays is that it is an essential component of the organizing tools, the organizing kits that socialists and unions have for generating the identities that are essential to class mobilization. So what I'm trying to do in this book is, on the one hand, restore the materialism that is essential to Marxist sociology, to Marxist social theory, which says that social formations come and go based on the material considerations of the classes, not through ideology per se. Every social formation is rooted in a class structure which is important because of the way it generates class capacities and class interests. So I've restored interests to the core of the social theory that Marx has had. But then I don't erase the importance of ideology, I just reassign it. In stabilizing capitalism, it's a secondary factor because it provides rationalizations. In mobilizing workers, it is a crucial factor because it helps generate political identities. So whereas the New Left thought ideology stabilizes the system, in my view, ideology is part of the destabilizing package of collective struggles. That's in very condensed form, that's the theory.
Thanks very much. And again, although I'm often identified as in my style, crazy postmodern guy who includes dirty jokes, jumps here and there, I try not to be. I often fail, write and talk like Vivek. Because I know that there are many so-called postmodern Marxists, and one of them even gave me the most disgusting pseudo-Hegelian justification of it. I told him, but you are inconsistent. It's not clear what you want to say. You know what was the answer I got? This inconsistency is in reality itself. So precisely through being inconsistent and self-contradictory, I give the adequate image of reality, blah, blah, blah. So let me just improvise a couple of points. You, Vivek, wonderfully pointed out how the great classics, Marx, Lenin, and so on, it's not simply that they didn't see what you, Vivek, were saying about in their political practice, even in their descriptions. They smelled it, but something was missing in poor conceptualization. And that's again what I think about your, Vivek, your work. We were all, many of us, who are all bothered by the same problem. What's the deep shit we are in? What's wrong? Why action doesn't happen? We smelled it, knew it, but here I am a materialist Christian in the sense of the word is logos is not at the beginning, but at the end. At the beginning, it's a mess. Then somebody here, Judith, Vivek, has to say the word, has to clearly formulate it. And all of a sudden, even if you don't agree with everything, but the proper terrain is formulated. So first, let me begin by a self-critical remark for somebody who is perceived as Lacanian, psychoanalytic, Marxist, whatever. I think, and this was even my founding experience, if I may permit myself this new age term, that psychoanalysis was often, unfortunately, used in the Western Marxist tradition exactly in the way you, Vivek, described the reference to ideology. It was Marxist economic analysis is correct and so on, blah, blah, but there is no revolution, no collective organization. So not even ideology. They claimed, psychoanalysis will give the answer. And then you evoke all the obscurity of, death drive, perversion, and so ever, as if we will get the answer there. That's the temptation we should absolutely resist. And let me give you an example. Allow me to make a couple of points. That's my first point of this, what you, Vivek, called the materialism. I think that for me, the formative experience was not mine. I was happy to have a permanent state job, academic, but my experience with precarious workers, like it was in London, of all places, that a couple of times I don't like Uber, they exploit workers too much, but how does Uber exploit workers? In a way which, not as an ideal force up there, but in their very material experience of work, in some sense, it makes them feel free, not only free, but even small entrepreneurs of their own. An Uber guy told me, listen, it's wonderful. There is no capitalist exploitation. He even knew about Marxism. He says, you see, I own my own means of production, my car, so nobody is exploiting me. The company is just providing to me the general frame, and I work when I want to work, in my conditions, in this sense, and so on and so on. And then I failed, but I engaged in a debate with a guy because I tried to tell him, but do you know to what extent, like, your long-term perspectives are uncertain? You don't have healthcare, security, and all other stuff. And he was aware of it, but he said, and I am now doing pretty well, I don't care about that. And he wasn't stupid. I understood him. In a way, he lived relatively well. He said, if I want, I take a weekend off, I work when I want. Another thing, and here I come back to your point, Vivek, is that I told him, but are you aware that instead of experiencing your situation like we all Uber drivers against the company, Uber, their blah, blah, you perceive your competitors as the other Uber drivers. The very form of this Uber precarious work in its materiality, not in some complex collective psychology level, prevents solidarity. Because again, in your material everyday life, your company, which is really reaping the profit, appears innocent. Oh, they're just organizing it. And the bad guys are your co-workers, precisely. So here I see a simple situation where without any big, deep psychology notions or whatever, you can see how, in this specific case, how the very material organization of precarious work, in the sense of Uber driving, prevents social solidarity, and especially important since we live in an era where fetishism of choice is almost the main choice, even if choices are vacuous. What are our choices, even in politics? Mostly they are like, Pepsi Cola or Coca-Cola and that type of stuff, But the point is that they make you experience, but again, in your concrete material life circumstances, they make you experience as a free agent, a small entrepreneur of the self, because again, that's the big category of today's capitalism. The idea is, and again, I read it in a materialist way, in Vivek's sense. It's not something preached out. That's the big.
Can I just say one thing? Slavoj, let me say one thing.
Please.
Taking Uber as an example. My view, my general approach, which I think is the approach socialists used for more than a century, is that you start on the assumption that workers have a pretty good understanding of their working conditions. They're not fooled by it. They're not duped by it. So let's look at Uber. Okay, Uber drivers are exploited in some way. They are part of the working class in some way. But then they have this feeling, as you said, that, look, I'm my own boss.
Yeah.
Now, is that a mistake? Well, it's not, in the following way.
Yeah.
That they are capturing accurately a dimension of their laboring experience, because they are, in fact, in a labor process where they have a great deal of autonomy from managerial control compared to somebody in a Walmart or an Amazon warehouse or in a factory or in a fast food restaurant. Now, this has been true throughout the history of capitalism. Workers, Uber drivers, are sort of like owner-operators or like farmers, independent farmers who sell their products to a marketing board or to a merchant who then exploits them through manipulating prices. If you asked a worker throughout the history of capitalism, we will give you a choice. You can work in a factory where there's an overseer bossing you around every minute of the day, or you can work at home or drive your own rickshaw or drive your own bicycle or drive your own taxi. You'll still be subject to some controls, but it'll be a different kind of control. Which of these two would you like? They have always preferred some degree of independent control over their own labor. So what's distinguishing the Uber driver from a factory worker is what we call the labor process, the facts about the labor process. And when he says to an intellectual, hey, I'm much more free here, a lot of intellectuals will then try to convince him that he's not. But he in fact is. He is driving the car, and he'd much rather be driving the car than being bent over a production line manipulating physical objects. But those same Uber drivers today, in fact, are trying to organize. This is true across the capitalist world. There is a growing wave of organizing drive amongst Uber drivers, which means they are aware of the fact that they have some autonomy, and they are aware of the fact that their bosses, Uber or whatever company it is taking a very large cut of the money that they're making, and in fact is subjecting them to all sorts of other kinds of liabilities and injustices. So both facts are true. And there's nothing that the Uber drivers, that we're going to tell the Uber drivers as we are highfalutin intellectuals, that they don't already know. Now, why is their organizing experiencing such mixed success? It's for the reasons Slavoj says. They are workers, but they're atomized. They don't interact with other workers. They only see them for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And in fact, they might even be competing with those workers in many ways, which is kind of true in capitalism generally.
I mean, maybe you don't see them at all, right? There's not like a hall like there would be if you're a taxi cab driver.
So when you do an analysis of Uber and you try to ask two questions, why has there been less organizing amongst Uber drivers than other kinds of workers? And then why is the organizing, when it happens, somewhat less successful? It's all material and social factors. It's not ideology. The material and social factors are doing all the work of explaining it here. What the role of ideology is that they need to be able to generate a collective identity so that they can make their drive successful. But it's the material and social factors that explain why generating the identity is so difficult for the reasons you just said. They don't see each other. They compete with each other. They have all sorts of other constraints. So from an organizer, from a socialist standpoint, even something like Uber, the basic facts about their subordination and their organizing are all structurally explained. You don't have to resort to ideology to explain any of them. And their own perceptions are quite accurate.
But Vivek, just really briefly on that, I mean, couldn't an organizer sometimes use shorthand like, hey, don't be a dope, like the boss is really... the boss wants you to think that you're free, but really, like, look at it. How much do you get to determine?
But the key point is this. When you say to him, the boss wants you to think you're free, but you're not, for your discourse, for your argument to be successful, you have to point to actual facts about their laboring conditions and their laboring experience, which means that you have to respect their knowledge. You cannot treat them as people who don't understand their circumstances. What you're doing is highlighting some circumstances over others. Now, but for the organizer, that means the first task is not to come out of your seminar or your party training and lecture to them about the nature of the proletariat. The first task is to learn the everyday, quotidian, ordinary aspects of their existence, which you don't yet know. But what are you doing when you try to learn those everyday aspects of their existence? You are admitting that is their circumstances to which they're responding and not the wrong-headed conceptions in their heads. And until you understand those circumstances, you can't organize them, which is a tacit acceptance that it is their location in the structure and the facts about the structure that explain why they're doing what they're doing and not simply phantoms in their head.
If I mean, I deeply agree with what Vivek, you said, in what level. I think that although we were all trained by them, learned a lot from them, from Western Marxists, but especially in their extreme forms, like he's not always bad, but some of the texts by Marcuse, some speculations by Adorno and Horkheimer, it's really behind it a kind of almost paranoid theory of total manipulation. Ordinary people are totally manipulated and so on and so on. So they paint a picture which is in a way self-defeating. They paint a picture from which it is already clear that nothing can happen. And I don't have time to develop this, but this is a sense in which I think much of today's this predominant liberal left critical thought almost, I will be now cynical myself, enjoys its defeat, enjoys painting the situation as the one of total manipulation where we cannot win and so on and so on. But let's not lose time on this. I want to go to another point which seems to me crucial. The way you, Vivek, turned around this notion of ideology. Yes, what's the strategy of, I don't use this term in paranoiac way, of those in power. The moment workers try to organize, okay, if I were to be official ideologist, I try to use this term in a non-paranoiac way, or propagator, and you read this all the time, and Uber drivers try to organize themselves, I would tell them, but no, we live in a post-ideological world. You are anachronistic, It's the ruling discourse. And again, I agree with you, Vivek, this is not a couple of big guys paid by I don't know whom, but this is their experience that if you mention trade unions and so on, no, you are talking about the old industrial capitalism, we live in a different world, and so on and so on. So how the category of anachronism is crucial here. Next thing, this is not, now I come to, I don't think we have a disagreement here. I will try to be still a materialist, but I would say this, the line of reasoning which is present by some disappointed Marxists, I wonder, Vivek, if you would also reject it like I do, is now I have problems with him, ultra-Maoist Alain Badiou. You know what is very brutally his answer to revolutionary non-activity of the working class in Western countries? In a kind of a brutal Leninist, Maoist way, he says, yes, they are all from the global perspective of the entire world. All of the Western Europe and United States is already workers' aristocracy. They are already bribed, so we should simply discount them. They are no longer, and then they are involved into this. It's the worst thing. This eternal, I remember it from my youth. I must be older than you, Vivek. How in '68, you know, the big problem was, yes, revolution, but who will be the subject? They, in their idealist way, wrote off the actual working class.
Yeah.
So then there was this search, eternal romanticizing temptation. Either students, the idea was students are the truly exploited, then, and I never liked it. Did you notice how even today, the Western left is desperately searching for an idealized third world country where it's the real thing?
Now the thing is not, it used to be, Slavoj, it was the peasantry under the influence of Maoism. The peasants were supposed to,
yes.
Now it's the indigenous.
Yeah. Intelligent colonizers always knew how to incorporate indigenous elements to make their system of colonization stable. For example, I know maybe you also do very little bit of situation in India where, you know, there is one of the most terrifying books that I know, The Loss of Manu, I think, a systematic description of everything, even, you know, how do you make love? I love this. I know.
There's a very good section on how to take a shit.
Yeah.
And I think there is
even a part there on, you know, after ejaculation, in what way do you wipe your penis, whatever. But you know what I learned then through my Indian friends? In 17th, 18th century, this book was half forgotten. The British colonizers resuscitated it because they got it, that it's much better for the exploitation. Not that formula, I never liked it, that under capitalism, colonizers wanted us to imitate them. No, there is also a very strong colonialist multiculturalism, not in the authentic sense, but in the sense of let them have their own culture.
Slavoj, I want to go back to what you said about Badiou because it's very important. I don't want that point to get lost because it's a very widely held notion among the white left in Europe and the United States and some sections now of the left coming out of minorities that the working class has been bought off in the West, and that its standards of living are too high, or that it's living on the fruits of imperialism, and therefore it cannot be a political agent. And it's a profoundly idiotic notion, because on the one hand, it is completely unaware of the recent history of the West, and secondly, it has a ridiculous theory of imperialism, which is also completely false. Now, for a second, I want to set aside the issue of the theory of imperialism. Let's just focus on the empirical descriptive claim they're making, that the working class has been bought off or is too well off. These theories are promulgated, as you said, in 68, the generation of 68, that new left. Let's just examine 68 for a second. What happened in 68? 68 was the last great wave of strikes and labor uprisings in the West. Exactly at the moment that the student left is writing off the Western working class, the Western working class went into the largest wave of strikes we had seen since the 1940s. That was in the midst of the highest wages that the working class had had in the 20th century. So first of all, the idea that wage levels, rising wages, make workers conservative was blown to bits right there, right in 1968, because their wages were so high. Secondly, the idea that the working class is therefore too well off to do anything is also blown to bits right there in 1968. Yeah? The question for us is why, and I address this in my book a little bit. Why, when wages are so high, did workers organize in 68 and go into strike activity? It's because the material well-being of workers includes many things other than just wages. What was happening in the late 60s in the United States and Europe? Wages had gone up, but so had work intensification. So had the level of injuries. Work days were getting longer and longer. Unions were no longer responding. That's why so many of these strikes are what we called wildcat strikes. They were strikes that the unions had not authorized. Workers were angry not at just at their bosses, but also at the unions, and wanted to disrupt the unions. All of this happens in 1968 in the middle of the greatest prosperity that capitalism has ever seen, and in the middle of rising standards of living if you just measure them through wages. Even at that moment, this theory was blown to bits. But now look what's happened in the past 30 years. The notion that the white working class has been living high on the hog, or has been having this incredibly lavish lifestyle since the 1980s, is, for the left to advance such ideas, is disgraceful. Not only have standards of living been stagnating, not only has the workplace conditions been getting worse, not only has there been more and more speed up, for the first time in a century, the white working class in the United States has found its life expectancy shortening. For the first time, with all the medical advances, with all this glorious somehow, this supposed increase in standard of living, they are dying faster than they did 10 years ago. They're in the middle of an opioid crisis where the level of death in this country from opium overdoses, from drug overdoses, and there's a reason why Angus Deaton calls it deaths of despair. It's coming from, on the one hand, a steady deterioration in their standards of living, and on the other, a conviction that nobody cares. Nobody gives a shit. The political parties don't care. The intelligentsia doesn't care. The media doesn't care. In fact, they're told if you're white and you're poor, you must be the biggest loser in the world because all of the imperial profits in the world come to you and you're still poor. It's all your fault. This is the reality that they face. And this is what I think finally the left is. You're right. There are a lot of sections of the left that still prefer a dark-skinned person in a hula dress as their universal subject. They still prefer that because it's exotic. But finally, there is, I think, in the United States and in some parts of Europe, a realization that white people can also be exploited. And that the struggle for justice isn't a tribal struggle between different colored people. It's a struggle between classes. And there's multicolored people on top and multicolored ones on the bottom. This is coming around. But this view that you described accurately is repellent. This notion that the majority of the Western European population can be written off because they don't abide by some mistaken picture that the left has in its head. That left does more damage than it does good.
I wanted to ask, sort of along these lines, Vivek, what you're saying is, your book, I think, does a really good job at giving sort of the negative case of why, especially when we're thinking about working people's organizing, there are so many obstacles that are bound up with the class structure itself that, we can think it doesn't require a big, as Slavoj also said, a big complex ideological theory, big complex psychological theory. I'm curious, though, about, it's interesting to write this kind of book at this time, say in the United States context, because there are some genuinely crazy things that people seem to believe, like, for instance, that the 2020 election was stolen, and there is, around figures like an intense seeming adherence to personalities on the right, etc., that relatively neglected, exploited people, like some of the people you're describing, are often beholden to. And obviously, there's a long history of thinking about, ideology as helping to explain kind of the seeming irrationalism in the history of ideology, theory of ideology about racism. And then, today in thinking about, well, why do people believe, some people believe vaccines have chips in them or whatever. So I'm just curious, what you think about.
Look, the view that I hold is not that ideology does not exist, or that people don't misunderstand things about the world, or they're not misinformed. The view that I hold is quite simple, which is that the more you ask questions about people's immediate experiences, the less they're going to be fooled by ideology. So if for socialists, the first order of business was always organizing workers against their bosses, organizing workers at the workplace around their interests. Now, on those issues, what are my basic interests with regard to my job conditions, my wages, the speed of work, what I need outside the workplace, I need as a working person? On those issues, you should expect workers aren't fooled. They have a pretty good understanding of what their interests are. But the more you move outside their direct experience and ask them their judgments about matters for which they need access not to their direct experience, phenomenological experience, but to information. So an example, economic policy. If you ask a worker, what are your basic needs, your economic needs, they're going to be pretty accurate in what they tell you. Pretty accurate as in you have no reason to misjudge what they're saying because they experience it every day. They know that if I don't have a good enough wage, I can't buy food. They know that if I don't have some sort of limit to the working day, I'm working myself to death. They know that if I don't have some sort of childcare, we have very difficult decisions in our family about who's going to stay at home and take care of the child. They know these things. They will have a pretty good understanding of them. Now you ask them, what kinds of economic policies can make it better on these very dimensions for you? What policies will help you hold on to your job? What policies will help you have rising higher wages? What are they supposed to tell you? On that, they have no direct experience. They have to rely on the views of experts. Now ask them, what kinds of policies, what do you think went down in this election? Do you think it was a fair election? Were the votes counted fairly? They don't know. For these sorts of things, the last two, policies, what happened in election, they have to rely on information that other parties are giving them. And that information can be manipulated. Now, in the United States, why do so many working class people believe that the election was stolen when it clearly was not? I think it's not that hard to understand. First of all, they believe the system is rigged top to bottom. They believe everybody on both sides of the political spectrum is corrupt in the political establishment. They also believe that nothing is beyond these people. They believe that if they can, they'll take everything away from me because they've been taking it away for the last 40 years. And they also understand that they are powerless to stop it. They're completely cynical about the system. They believe it's been captured by the elites. They believe the elites will do anything to hold on to it. And now, along comes Trump, somebody who they believe is contemptuous, which he is, of the system because he's a sociopath. And he says to them, look, this party stole. And why would they believe Trump? Two reasons. The party's been screwing them over for 40 years. The party's candidates openly tell them that there's nothing we can do. When Clinton and his when Bill and Hillary Clinton passed NAFTA, and in the aftermath of NAFTA, when people's lives were devastated, what did the Democratic Party tell them? Free trade, man. Free trade is like the laws of gravity. There's nothing you can do. You lost your job? Tough shit. Suck it up. Go find a better job. This is their party telling them this. Now they're told that that same party has stolen the election. And there is a chunk of them that will believe it because they're utterly cynical about the system. And what did I say in my book? For the working class, when it finds that it has no power in its class position, its go-to ideology, its natural ideology is cynicism and a belief that the entire system is corrupt, because in fact, that's how you rationalize what's happening to you. Now, when you're already disposed to believing that the system is corrupt, of course, you're easy to manipulate on matters, but that you don't directly experience every day. Because you're dependent on information. I don't think it's a mystery at all, to be honest. I really don't. I think it's astounding that the left thinks that theories of false consciousness are to be tested in the electoral arena. Elections are the most complicated thing on earth. It's a very complex mix of emotions, rationality, and teasing all those things out is extremely difficult. The place you go if you really want to see if people are cognitively deficient, if they don't understand themselves, is in matters that they directly experience every day. And on those matters, you ask, for 40 years, Americans have been asked, what's the most important thing for you in your life? They always give the same answer, economic issues. It's always the same answer, economic issues. Now they're asked, what should we do about them? And then they're all over the place because at that moment they reach for information, external information, and they have no source. Every single avenue of information in America is a bourgeois institution. Every single one. What do you expect these people? They're supposed to spontaneously have a trade policy, spontaneously have political... This is just nonsense. It's from an intelligentsia that despises the poor. You hold your standards up high and you go, if you don't meet these standards, you're irrational. You have false... It's just nonsense.
I cannot agree more than I do with you, Vivek. Why? Let me first, just a couple of short notes. First, 68. Did you notice, I noticed, because I'm old enough, blah, blah, I was there, how some commentator put this nicely? The way we remember today 60s, it's basically not 60s, but 70s. Because when the system stabilized itself, all the social components in France, you remember the highest moment, students joining striking workers from a Renault factory and so on, all that disappears and 60s remain orgies, sexual freedom, free use of drugs, and so on and so on. It's incredible how we falsely reinvented the 60s. Next point, I think it's very important, Vivek, what you mentioned. It's not just in quantitatively determined standard of living, how much you earn. It's one factor which concerns very much daily experience, which is, as you pointed out, this intensity, hyperactivity, and so on and so on. And would you agree? That's my question to you, Vivek. Would you agree about 2 points? First, that one, paradoxically, of the reasons of the stability of the system, it's precisely its hyperactivity. It's not that you don't do anything. You have to survive today. You have to be hyperactive all the time. And precisely this hyperactivity doesn't give you not even a chance to withdraw, but more important, now I come to my topic. It's crucial what you said about this. People don't believe it, cynical, distance, and so on. Would you agree, or am I going a little bit too far? But I tend to believe myself here that cynicism today, it's not a failure of ideology. It's the most popular, almost common everyday ideology. And as such, I don't think it really bothers the system. It's almost, I would say, in the interest of the capitalist system that people don't take seriously how to get politically organized and so on. What the regime prefers is something like politics always gets corrupted, you will always be screwed up, just stick to your private interests. So we have this paradox that maybe the predominant mode of, I still call it ideology, is this cynical distance towards everything.
So let me take up both points.
Yeah.
I very much agree with both of them. And let me rephrase what you said. As regards the first point, which is what you called hyperactivity, I think this is a absolutely natural and pervasive consequence of neoliberalism. Now, by this hyperactivity, what are we really talking about? What we're talking about is, in the last 40 years, all of the protective institutions that the working class had built up from the 19-teens, trade unions, social safety nets, medical care, child care, neighborhood associations, social gatherings of any kind, have all been torn apart. Productivity has been stagnant, wages have been stagnant, precarity has become now pervasive. So what do workers do? They are constantly on the treadmill trying somehow to survive. The hyperactivity, Slavoj, that you're talking about is the hyperactivity of somebody trying not to sink when they've been thrown in the water. They're just working their asses off. They're terrified. They don't know what old age is going to bring them. They don't know what will happen if they fall sick. The biggest cause of bankruptcies in the United States today is when somebody falls sick. How barbaric is a system where if you fall ill, you lose everything you have? So the hyperactivity is a material hyperactivity when you shut off everything else in your universe and you just look at getting through the day. And there is no better way of stabilizing the system than to turn people into hamsters who are just on this roller thing, constantly working, constantly just trying to stay alive. Your second point about cynicism flows directly from this. The cynicism, you're 100% right. You can call it ideology, and I do. It's a rationalization. But what is cynicism really? Cynicism is the belief that nothing can be changed. Now, it is a natural and accurate understanding of the reality around them when they are atomized, when they don't have political parties, when they don't have institutions. Of course, they'll become cynical because it's the only way they can make sense of the lives that they're living. When they have no choice in any important decision in their lives, the natural response to say is, this is just a fact of nature and I will never be able to change it. Now, your point was, doesn't this serve the ruling class? Of course, because when you're cynical, what's your natural next step? Is to opt out, is to give up, is to not try to change anything. Noam Chomsky said this a very long time ago. He said, the genius of the American system is this. It doesn't try to take away your rights. It just makes it not only impossible, but also to you, it seems pointless to try to exercise those rights. You don't need authoritarianism in America. Half the population already doesn't vote. You don't need to make people scared of changing something because they already believe they can't change anything. That is a natural response to cynicism, and it is astounding to see self-styled progressive and liberals now come and heap shit on these people because they're cynical about the system, because they're not organizing, because they'll be easily manipulated, because they feel that the election is stolen. Trump didn't invent this. Hillary Clinton did. For 4 years, she said she won the election, but the Russians stole it. 4 years. And it's supposed to be Trump who is the stolen election dude? Both parties are doing this. Both parties are slowly encroaching on the democratic space. And as long as the left continues to heap opprobrium and criticism towards the majority of the population, because they're too white, too male, too hetero, this and that and the other, it just tells you it's not a left. It is a section of the middle class that has found a way to express its contempt for working people, contempt for the working class, either through writing them off or through the exoticism. Why are they exotic? I'll tell you why. Because you can't go to Bolivia and organize these indigenous. You could just watch movies about them and talk about it. So look at your life. You are now a revolutionary socialist who has written off the working class and who thinks the revolutionary agent is somebody who you'll never actually be able to see in your life. What's the result? Very convenient. I never have to do anything. I can simply watch black and white documentaries about the sexual mores of Bolivian peasants and talk shit about the working class as being white supremacist. That's your left.
I totally agree. Sorry, please.
So one other question, I think I think that is right. And I think there's, a kind of call in this book to organize, for the left to think of themselves as organizers rather than as sort of contemplative outsiders looking at the irrationality of the social scene and sort of being, whatever, eating your popcorn while the world collapses. I think one question I have, I guess for both of you really, because, Slavoj, you're in many ways, I think your oeuvre, your life's work is ideology critique. And so I'm wondering, the call for leftists to take organizing seriously, to think about interests, is there what place does ideology critique have in that? Is there a future for ideology critique and also for the more kind of constructive project of ideology, sort of socialist ideology construction that Vivek, you point to? I'm curious about both of your thoughts on that.
Let me check this
very briefly. Please, Vivek, if you want, go on.
I think there's this ideology critique is in fact central for the left, even though I think that the world runs on material interests. So how is it central? Well, there are two ways, one obvious and one perhaps not so obvious to today's left. One way in which it's central is that even though workers make their choices based on material considerations, they rationalize those choices through an ideological apparatus. And oftentimes when you encounter workers, you will find them steeped in what you regard to be ideology because they have to live with their lives. Some of that ideology will be harmless, cynicism. Some of it will be quite pernicious. So, for example, the racism that one sees in a lot of American workers is a way of dealing with their own insecurity. There's this ridiculous concept that left academics like to work with called racial resentment, which means that white workers are angry or they're racist because they resent the fact that blacks have better lives, which is really absurd. And someday in Catalyst, we need to have an article on this because the very same data that seems to show racial resentment is actually showing racial anxiety. And that's two very different things. It's one thing to be anxious about your jobs and not want a Mexican to take it over. It's quite another to say, why does this Mexican lead a decent life? I resent him for doing so. Resentment is the wrong term. But you will find racism. You will find a lot of misogyny. And you have to now try to get workers to come out of it. They will not come out of it if you simply wag your finger at them. They will come out of it if you talk to them about why they hold these notions and if you explain to them everything they have to gain by ditching those notions. So you get out of ideology through organizing around people's material interests, not by shaming them, not by dismissing them. You encounter workers typically in some way or form steeped in ideology. So all organizing starts as ideological critique. The point of my book is the ideological critique cannot work unless it's anchored in an understanding of people's actual interests. And they'll tell you what those interests are. You don't have to go tell them. They already understand them. That's point number one. Point number two is this. A lot of the work of ideological critique has to do with undoing the damage of the intelligentsia. The problem, if you really want to find ideology, don't look to workers, look to intellectuals. Nobody believes bullshit ideology and bullshit ideas more than intellectuals do. So some of what we're doing on the left today, why do I write a book like The Class Matrix? No worker's going to read it, very few are. It's designed to show that the real problem right now is the left intellectuals and the garbage theories that they've been propagating. So much, you look at the organization you're in, Jeremy, the DSA, it's filled with garbage. It's filled with virtue signaling. It's filled with notions, this pandering to identity politics, all of which is middle-class politics. A lot of what the work inside political organizations right now has to be ideological critique, not of workers, but of the middle class that claims to be on the left. Much of what Marx did, what was the Capital is a critique of political economy, he is not only trying to develop political economy, he's also critiquing political economy that he has received from the classical tradition as being steeped in ideology. So we do ideology critique in two ways. One is, as organizers, you critique the everyday spontaneous ideological rationalizations that workers have. That's the easy part. The harder part is if you're circulating among intellectuals to try to get parts of the intelligentsia to see the ideology in their work and in their colleagues' work. Because unlike workers who have a material interest in ditching nonsensical notions, intellectuals do not. And today's intelligentsia has a material interest in propagating bullshit. That's the heart. Now, why should you do that? Because the fact is, a lot of the left today is in middle-class circles, in universities, in academia, and those who are well-intentioned, those who want to do good, are misled by what we would call ideology, which is these forms of liberal identitarianism, virtue signaling, genuflecting in various ways. And one has to try to equip them with a better understanding of capitalism and hopefully motivate them to do real politics and not this symbolic cosplay politics that so much of the left does. That's all I have to say.
I just want to add something because something is missing here. At the end, somebody should pull out a knife because we are just agreeing with each other. I like this. Again, one point. I see not a hope. It's a very dangerous phenomenon, but we should build on it. Maybe this is more typically European. I followed through my friends and so on, something specific about, and they are not always the good guys, this new type of social protests in Western Europe, like Gilets jaunes, Yellow Vests in France, Podemos in Spain, and so on. This is discontent, but which is not, so it's not cynicism, passivity. They want to do something. But it's obvious that they cannot articulate themselves in the existing options of the political space. The moment Podemos did this, they are now a very modest social democratic party. And that's one argument often listed that I like to mention again and again, how, when in America they were saying Bernie Sanders, crazy socialist. If you compare Bernie Sanders' most radical statements by, let us say, Swedish, I don't idealize them, but around the Swedish social democracy program in the 60s, they are ultra more radical and so on. But the point I want to make is that this movement and with yellow shirts protesting in France, it's even more ambiguous. You cannot clearly identify them. You have even elements of anti-immigrant racism, a little bit, but it is a genuine discontent which cannot be translated into existing political space. Where I experienced this at its purest? Once in the middle of, or towards the end of Tony Blair's reign in the UK, I was in London and I watched a week before elections, general elections, some big popular tens of thousands of people participating opinion poll, who is the most hated person in the UK? Tony Blair won. A week later, there were elections, Tony Blair won. So obviously, there is some discontent here, very dangerous one, which maybe gives some hope. The second thing about cynicism of this pseudo-radical liberal middle class left, what is, now I will not go into theory, but a very personal experience. That's why I hate them. A friend asked me, are you against death penalty? My answer was, yes, I am, but after we shoot some of the people who deserve it, and among them, the aesthetic, this great art biennales. They are art at its purest, totally immersed into capitalism, but their ideology, their introduction, it has to be anti-Eurocentric. They even include awareness of it, how we know we are totally manipulated by, but as such, they fit perfectly into it. So I totally agree with you. Yes, Stalinist purges, sorry, not literally. Next, my final point, where would you agree or not? But not that I try to save traditional critique of ideology, but the part which I often emphasize, and I would really like to conclude your Vivek possible critical or not opinion, is that what I find so fascinating in Marx is that in Capital, where he analyzes not ideology in this abstract sense, but actual life experience, ideas, presuppositions which are part of material reality, he speaks about things like commodity fetishism, which, interestingly enough, he doesn't dare to call, he never calls it ideology.
Right.
But it is an illusion which is not ideology in the sense that elaborated by professors, priests, whatever. It's part of your daily experience. And I think we should, even when ordinary people, and by this I mean us also, when we are confused, don't think ideology in the sense of all the books behind. Think about illusions that you follow in your daily life, even if you, in your full awareness, would say, of course, I don't believe it. If you allow me to conclude with the joke, which is my favorite joke on ideology today, which I used, I would say, about 40, 50 times in my work or whatever, but it's perfect. Niels Bohr, the great guy, Copenhagen. You know the story, you must know it. He was visited by a friend in his country house where he saw a horseshoe above the entrance to the house. And the friend, another scientist, asked him, but you are a scientist, this is superstition. In Europe, this means a horseshoe above the entrance prevents evil spirits to enter the house. And Niels Bohr gave a perfect answer. He says, of course, I'm a scientist, I don't believe in it, but I have it there because I was told that it works even if you don't believe in it. That's how cynicism today works. You don't have to believe in it. Look, that would be my lesson to ordinary people, among whom I include myself, especially university professors, workers, and so on. Isn't it that often? My last question to you, Vivek. I found a passage in, otherwise he's often too liberal for me, but nonetheless a nice one, in George Orwell, the early Orwell for 37, when he noticed at that point already that many progressive intellectuals, they see injustice in the world, they protest against it, but that if you look closely at it, they are hyperactive, but you can feel like, let's talk all the time about change to make sure that nothing will really change. That's the horror that I feel with many today's critical theory intellectuals. They talk about change, but the moment change comes close, they withdraw, and there is another thing which I especially hate, it's pseudo-opportunist radicalism. Whenever there is a chance of maybe a small change, like Bernie Sanders, I don't idealize him, but I have many disagreements with AOC, the beautiful one, but she said something wonderful when Bernie was attacked by some feminists. She said, in your spirit, Vivek, I think, she said, he is so precious to us precisely because he is an old white man.
Yeah.
Such people can also be for us. And okay, some of my radical friends said, no, he is just an old social democrat. This is not yet the true revolution, and so on and so on. What I almost absolutely hate today, even more than cynicism, which is, as you pointed out, Vivek, our everyday experience, understandable, is this, how should I call it, principled opportunism. You wait for some true, authentic revolution, which means whenever some movement really begins, you say, oh, this is still in bourgeois limits, it means nothing, and so on and so on. That's what really horrifies me.
Yeah, let me pick up on a couple of points, Slavoj, because I agreed with everything you said. We are both now talking about ideology critique within the intelligentsia and within the middle class. That's what we're talking about. And what you find it in two different ways. One is their interests coming out in the narrowing of what the ambitions are for social change. And fundamentally, this is narrowing it so that social change becomes upward mobility for the middle class. So what we call identity politics today is not any longer anti-oppression politics. It's not changing the lives of working class Black people or working class women. It is increasing the chances for mobility for Black professionals, Black politicians, Black business people, and for women, exactly the same, women professionals, women politicians, etc. So racism is now something that inhabits the top echelons. It's astounding. Here's Bernie Sanders talking about making community colleges free for everybody. But in New York City, the debates around education are about why there aren't more Black students in the most selective high school in the city. In universities, the debate is why Harvard, Yale, Princeton don't have a more diverse student body, not about why schools for Black working class people are crumbling. So this so-called movement for racial justice is actually a movement for upward mobility of elites within these sections of the population. That's counter to social change, but it in fact is simply a naked expression of class interests. Now let's talk about the cynicism that you're talking about. The other way in which you see, so this is one way, I call it simply contempt for the poor. What today's identitarianism is a contempt for working class Black people and working class women by their own elites. It's just like nationalism has been throughout the history of the world. Nationalism was always captured by elites and then turned into a program for their own upward advancement. Now, let's look at this ultra-leftism. Well, why is nothing good enough for you if you're an ultra-leftist? Because it absolves you of the responsibility of trying to do anything. You're still waiting. You're waiting for that perfect moment, that perfect movement, that perfect upheaval. And so this is exactly what the exoticism is. Why is the exoticism so appealing to so much of the Western left? Because it's a faraway land. It's all occurring someplace, somewhere that you'll never have to be, never have to go. And now you can commodify it, you can aestheticize it, you can talk about it all you want, but at no cost to yourself, no sacrifice to yourself. It's no surprise that a lot of this aestheticized, exoticized discourse is also incomprehensible. It's impenetrable. Because when you're saying things, as you saw in my book, Slavoj, the Orientalism, when I'm a critique of post-colonial theory,
yeah.
Why is post-colonial theory impossible to understand? It's because they're racist. It's because if they openly say dark people can't do math, brown people don't understand their interests, it'll sound a lot like 19th century colonialists. So they have to couch it in an impenetrable language to give it the appearance of profundity, whereas in fact it's garden variety racism. So we are in an intelligentsia right now that not only has given up on trying to change the lives of the vast majority, it never had any interest in it. The left, if it's going to come about again, will have to be a left that recaptures the spirit of humility, sacrifice, clarity, and ambition. That it's not enough to open up some spaces for upward mobility for minority elites. The project is about changing the lives of the vast majority, which means taking on those very elites that are trumpeting these tiny little eddies right now of social progress, what they call social progress. I think we're only at the very earliest stages of that. I think the left, from the days of Lenin, has basically died. And in its wake has left a great deal of quite destructive cultural, intellectual, and political baggage. I think we are now going to have to rediscover, as the left in the late 19th century did, that the way to social progress is through and with working people, not around them. And it's our responsibility to make ourselves relevant to them, not their responsibility to make themselves appealing to us.
Can I add an important conclusion? Sorry. Just Vivek to reply. But this was crucial for me when you said, yes, everyday experience of ordinary people, but at a certain point, economic politics and so on, they need experts. And what I liked so much, whenever, and even through my obscenities, it's easy for me to find link. I'm not patronizing them, I'm dirtier than them, with the so-called ordinary people. But you know what I always respected from them? They have all so-called, sorry to use the term, ordinary people were immensely sensitive to for high intellectuals to patronize them in the way which appears egalitarian. I was told by Terry Eagleton that one big British historian, that's the lesson for me, in the 70s, late 60s, wanted to do, it was fashionable there. He went, I don't think it was Eric Hobsbawm, maybe it was him, I'm not sure. He went to a big factory and gave a speech to workers. And he began with this falsely solidary egalitarian view. He said, I'm here to learn from you. I don't know anything more than you. And then something sublime happened. An ordinary worker interrupted him and told him, sorry, no, you are paid to know things that we cannot know. You are here to teach us. Don't give us bullshit that you don't know more than us, and so on and so on. You see, there is also this false solidarity of the left. And Vivek, maybe this is my own example that will maybe amuse you. Another of my sublime experiences, I repeat it all the time, sorry, was when I was decades ago in Missoula, Montana. And I met some, how do you call them now officially, Native Americans. And then I met some actual Native Americans there. Of course, through exchange of obscenities, we immediately became friends. And then I used the term Indians, and immediately there was a politically correct white liberal who interrupted me. No, this is racist, they are Native Americans. And you know what my, whatever you call it, Native American Indian friend did? I fell in love with him. He said to the white liberal, first, please allow us to call ourselves the way we want. He said, I don't like to be called Native American because, sorry, the opposite of nature is culture. What are you? Cultural Americans. We are native. And then he finished with something beautiful. Maybe you know the joke, I'm sorry. He said, I much prefer to be called Indian because at least my name is then a sign of your white man's stupidity, who thought you were in India when you came here. So they have, I admire this with my black friends, my Native American, Indian, whatever friends, how sensitive they are to the falsity of this white liberal patronizing respect for their identity and so on.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Before we close, is there anything you two disagree about?
It looks very bad. When the two people are so close as we are, I think it looks very bad. I really enjoyed it so much. Thanks very much. And I hope it's not the last time.
I very much appreciate your taking the time, Slavoj. It's the first time we got the
I will try to make a jump over to New York if everything will not go wrong. Who knows? Maybe the universal money will already be rubles at that point. I will come there and NYU, Washington Square, that's my territory. So
Fantastic.
We can meet there. I
Fantastic. I look forward to it.
Thank you really both. Thank you to
much.
Vivek. Thank you to Zizek. I love the rhyme. I forgot to mention, but
I immediately noticed it. And you know what's the nicest thing? Mine is Zizek, Vivek. It's not Zizek or what, so it rhymes even more than it may appear.
Yeah. So thank you to you both. Thanks to our audience for watching. Please hit like, subscribe, and share the channel, Jacobin channel, with your friends. And again, Vivek and I can't even pronounce the names now. Vivek and Slavoj, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.